I don't know if anyone's going to read this. I don't even know if anyone will care. But I have to tell somebody. It's too much to process right now, and maybe if I get some of it off my chest, it will make it easier to handle. I'm getting ready to go into the unknown, and I feel like someone needs to know why. Someone needs to know how it came to all this, and how I came to be a potential murderer/avenging angel. Above all else, I need to tell someone about Charlie. I'd known Charlie since we were in grade school together. Charlie thought of us as brothers, since he didn't have any of his own and loved us like family. Despite that, never think we were the most important people in Charlie's life. No, the most important person in Charlie's life was his grandmother. Charlie's grandmother, he'd always called her Grandmom, was the one who raised Charlie since the day he was born. Charlie's mother died in childbirth, and his father died before he was even born, so without a guardian, that just left Charlie and his grandmom. Grandmom and Charlie. Charlie's grandmom lived out in the country, in an old wooden farmhouse with a big backyard and acres of fields for growing things. She rented the land to sharecroppers and must have done pretty well for herself, because Charlie couldn't recall a time she'd ever had to work. Charlie didn't have any other family, none that he'd ever met anyway, and for the first 8 years of his life it was just the two of them alone in that farmhouse. Charlie said he remembered being sick a lot as a kid, and most of his earlier memories were he and his grandmom on the couch while she nursed him back to health from one illness or another. Grandmom would sit at home with him while he convalesced, watching Sesame Street and eating whatever Grandmom could whip up in the kitchen. Most days, Charlie would just spend the whole day on her lap while she rocked him and hummed strange little Russian songs to him. Grandmom wasn't originally from here, you see. She had emigrated during the Second Great War, and she and his grandfather had moved out to the country because it reminded her of her childhood home. Coming from the old country, she had all kinds of folk remedies, good-tasting recipes, and strange little songs that she would sing to Charlie as he drifted off to sleep or lay sick on the couch. One in particular that Charlie recalled fondly had become a ritual of sorts, a ritual that goes on to this day, I assume, that took on the normalcy of time and repetition. She would take him on her lap, pull his face close to hers, and place her hands on his cheeks as she put their foreheads together. Charlie recalled the bumpy, veiny skin there beneath his smooth baby skin as she did this, and the warmth that always seemed to radiate from her. With their foreheads pressed together, she would sing a strange song to him in her thick Russian tone before releasing him and planting a kiss on his forehead. "What does it mean, Grandmom?" Charlie would always ask, and the asking was as much a part of the ritual as the ritual itself. "It means," she would say in her warm, gravelly voice, "always together, even when apart, always a part of me, here in my heart." Charlie had never thought it was odd that he lived in relative isolation with his grandmother, not until he started school. His grandmom had tried to homeschool him for a few years, but her teaching wasn't up to the state standards, so she had grudgingly allowed Charlie to attend public school. Here Charlie came into contact with other children, and first learned how strange his situation was. In class, we would do assignments or draw pictures of our family, and Charlie's was always the smallest when put up on the bulletin board with the rest. Charlie began to wonder why he didn't have any uncles or aunts or cousins, or any family besides Grandma. When he asked her, though, she always shrugged and gave him the same answer. "Your grandfather and I had the one child. Your father was not a strong boy. He was sick, often like you are, and we were afraid to have another. By the time he was old enough to over his sickness, your grandfather was dead, and it was only me and your father." That made Charlie feel a little better. His father had been like him in that sense, sickly and alone with his grandmom, so it couldn't be that strange. That didn't stop the other kids from teasing him, though. I remember Charlie when he first arrived at school, and the other kids had him pegged as an oddball from the get-go. Going to school in the early 90s, it was all about how cool you were, how many cool things you had on your clothes. Charlie showed up the first day of school looking like the boy from the hot chocolate box my mom always bought. He wore suspenders and stockings, knee boots, and shirts with weird fringes on them. He stuck out like a sore thumb. This, mixed with his funny way of talking and his stunted knowledge base, made the other kids think he was slow and kind of a dweeb. He came in for quite a bit of ridicule, and I recall it was a hard couple of days before my friends and I got involved. This is where I come into Charlie's story, I guess. I had never taken part in the teasing, and over time I began to feel bad for him. I pushed some of my friends to invite him to play with us, and we were surprised to find not a dumb kid, but an imaginative kid, who joined in our games eagerly. His grandmom, had taught him a little Russian, which we thought was just the coolest, and we gave him some of our old clothes to wear so he didn't stand out quite so much. Together, we played G.I. Joes or superheroes or whatever the game of the day happened to be, and outside of play, we helped Charlie stand up for himself and make the bullies stop. As we got older, Charlie stayed at our place a lot, and we really helped him come out of his shell and adapt to life outside of Grandmom's house. We were friends with Charlie all the way through high school, and after high school, we all thought we might get an apartment together. Zach, Tristan, Charlie, and I, so we could attend college together. Charlie was hesitant. He didn't want to leave his poor old grandmom alone in the middle of the woods. So when he turned up at the house a few days later with a scant few possessions, I was pretty surprised. He had 2 plastic bags of clothes, a zipper bag of toiletries. After some coaxing, he told me he and his grandmom had had a really nasty fight. This surprised me, because I'd never heard of Charlie's grandmom ever raising her voice to him in all the time I'd known him. And he seemed just as shocked about the outburst as we were. She had refused to give him any of his stuff, except what he'd brought with him, and told him not to expect her to send him money or anything else. If he moved out now, he was on his own. You could tell how upset he was, poor guy, and we helped him out as best we could. He ended up sleeping on my couch until his first Pell check came in, and after that, he just kinda made do. I had expected that would be the end of his closeness with his grandma, but I couldn't have been more wrong. After a few weeks of silence, she went back to calling him every day, and to our astonishment, he made plans to have dinner with her and help her with her shopping. She would send him money sometimes, and he would go over several days a week to eat dinner or lunch, and slowly things began to return to normal. She still wouldn't let him take any of his stuff out of her house, but he got some new stuff, and by the time his first semester was done, he had everything that he needed. Things went on in this way for about 3 years, at least until last Wednesday. Charlie and I had just got back from class when he got a call from his grandma. His face fell as they talked, and you could tell that Charlie was barely holding back tears. She hadn't been doing well for several years, nearly from the time Charlie moved out, and I personally thought it was a guilt trip to keep her grandson close to home, though I'd never say as much to Charlie. He talked to her for a few minutes and then immediately went to his room and packed an overnight bag. He told me to tell his counselor that he had a family emergency and needed to go home to be with his grandmother. When I asked him what was going on, he told me that she was dying and she wanted him to stay with her until she passed. I commiserated with him and told him to give her my best and to stay in contact so we knew when he'd be back. That was a week ago, and it was the last time anyone has ever seen or heard from Charlie. His car is gone, his things are gone from his room, and Charlie has disappeared without a trace. I drove the hour to his grandmother's house, hoping to find some clues when I got there, only to be greeted by a stranger when the door opened. She was a tall, dark-haired woman with lank hair and a swollen, pregnant belly, and she was no one I had ever seen before. Yeah, hell, Charlie and his grandmom were the only 2 people I'd ever seen at the house before now. She claimed to be a distant relative that had inherited the house from Charlie's grandmother when she died. She didn't seem to speak English very well, and was completely unsure as to who Charlie was or where he had gone to. We quickly lost patience with each other, and she yelled at me to leave before she called the authorities. I seethed all the way home, but I couldn't get any answers out of her. I got my answers last night. It was around 2 a.m. in the morning when something woke me up from a deep sleep. My legs were full of pins and felt like someone was sitting on them. I rolled over, thinking one of my roommates had wandered in drunk, only to find Charlie sitting on my bed. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was wrong. Charlie looked bad, withered somehow, like a grape that gets left in the crisper drawer for too long. Or a corpse after it's dried out in a grave. He spoke to me, his voice a rattling rasp in my ears, and told me that something had happened. He'd gone to be with his grandmom. He found her on her deathbed, and she'd reached for him with her withered arms when he'd come in. He'd slumped, weeping by her bedside, and she'd reached out with her wrinkled hands and touched his face. He looked at her, and she had asked him to put his forehead against hers, so she could say the words one last time. She was my grandmom, and I loved her. How could I deny her anything? He said, his voice racked with pain. So he let her draw his face to hers, and she said the old familiar words as she always had. Always together, even when apart. Always a part of me, here in my heart. But when she kissed him on the forehead, his lips already starting to ask what it meant, he felt something strange. It was like she was taking everything from me. My breath, my blood, my bones, my seed, and all with that single kiss on my forehead. As she had taken all of it from him, he had crumpled up into a dried husk as she changed before his eyes. Her hair darkened, her skin tightened, her eyes sparkled, and he said that her belly had grown large even as her breasts grew heavy with milk. When she stood over him, she was 50 years younger, a girl of 20, and I realized that she was the woman who had opened the door for me. She stood over him, cackling at his desiccated form, and her face was devoid of the love that had always been there. Now you see why I have kept you close all these years. Now you'll see the fruit of my labor, just as your father did before you and your grandfather before him, she said, looking down at Charlie without pity or remorse. Why? He asked huskily, his voice dry as a desert. Why have you done this? Why? This is the state that befalls all your line. Males for centuries and centuries. Males from the first of your name to crawl upon this earth. He told me I was ugly. He spat on my love, and he promised me that I would never have him. I promised him that I would have all of his line, bear them and break them. So I have from that time on. Your son, she said, and gave her belly a little stroke, will be no different. And as she stood cackling over him, Charlie died and passed into the void that waits beyond. He told me all of this as I sat huddled by the head of my bed, but promised me that she was wrong. She would have no more from his line. The cycle would end with his son. He told me some things he understood now, and called his grandmother a vedma, which is the Russian word for witch. He also called her a strigoi, but he hopes he's wrong about that. A mortal man may kill a vedma if he is very lucky, he told me, but a strigoi is another matter entirely. He made me promise if I ever called him friend, to rescue my son and kill his grandma once and for all. It will be dark soon, and he says that tonight will be the night of her delivery, which will make her weak. I'm leaving this here just in case I don't come back, in case someone out there might save Charlie's son if I fail. I have the things I need, and midnight will be here before I know it. I hope I'm strong enough to do what must be done. I pray I don't come to my friends in the night with a similar request. I pray that I can break this curse and make Charlie its last victim. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for tonight's creepy reading. If you like what you heard, feel free to follow us on Twitter, or maybe follow me on Patreon. I'd love to have your patronage. Or you can buy one of my books on Amazon. I'll be sure to link all that in the description below. Be sure to come back Sunday for another reading, and I hope to see you then. Dr. Plague, signing off.